Hello, and welcome back to online English class. I hope you guys are doing well. Today we're going to be working on OTN 6, which analyzes Gerard Manly Hopkins' use of poetic devices to develop the thematic impression of his great poem, God's Grandeur. I'm warning you, this is my favorite poem of all time. And so I'm really looking forward to sharing it with you and analyzing it carefully with you. All right, so a couple announcements before we jump into our work. Just remember your progress check, which is due next Tuesday. All right, Unit 5 progress check for you AP students. It's on AP Classroom. That is available. It's open, it's unlocked, and you can begin working on that. Remember also to keep an eye out for the bonus content for you AP Lit students of screen recording of me working through some of the trickier or perhaps more misleading questions from the Unit 4 progress check, okay? And I'll be doing that on a weekly basis as we approach the exam. Also, remember to email me confirmation of your OTN 4 and 5 by the end of today, by 3 p.m. today. Make sure that you include the word the letters OTN in the subject line of your email. That will be very helpful to me as I am trying to collect and enter those into the gradebook, so I can just easily sort through my inbox, which is going to have hundreds of emails in it as always these days. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into our analysis. Now the prompt is obviously intentionally very open-ended. It just simply says to use whatever poetic devices we can to analyze the use of any of those poetic devices and investigate the ways in which they develop the thematic impression of the poem. Okay, so we're going to consider all the devices we've discussed up to this point, including the way in which the speaker is characterized through his language throughout the course of the poem. We're going to consider obviously the words and the syntax and word order. We're going to consider the images at play and the imagery used throughout the course of the poem, the figures of speech used throughout the course of the poem, any symbols that might be developed throughout the course of the poem. We're going to look at the phonetic aesthetics of the poem, or the sonic devices used in the poem, including alliteration, assonance, rhyme. We're also going to look at the rhythm of the poem and the ways in which Hopkins is using rhythm to develop his meaning and to illustrate and make palpable his theme. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into the poem. As always, we're going to start with an SQ3R, and then we're going to do a quick reading of the poem, and then we're going to analyze the octet, or the first 8 lines of the poem. Then we're going to analyze the sestet next class, the second 6 lines of the poem, okay? So, as always, we want to survey the speaker, the genre, and the title of the text, okay? So the speaker of the poem is just an individual who is meditating on how God's grandeur has been made manifest in the physical world, okay? How God's grandeur, we'll talk more about that word, all right, in a little bit, but how God's grandeur has been made manifest in the world. This, although it seems like a simple kind of question, how has God's grandeur been made manifest in the world, is actually one that is at the core of the Christian worldview, and also those who are skeptical of the Christian gospel. Okay, how has God's revelation of himself, how has God revealed himself through his cosmos and its story, okay, history, how has God's revelation of himself in the sort of history of the world and the structure of the earth around us, how has it characterized its maker? What kind of God, if a God did indeed structure this cosmos and ordain its history, what does that mean about the person who is sovereign over it? How does it characterize the maker? Now, the skeptic answers this question, all right? For those of you who are seniors, you've been thinking about this during the apologetics section of your course, all right? The skeptic answers that question in a variety of ways, right? They might look at God's cosmos. They might look at the unfolding of history and say that God is characterized as indifferent, cold, distant, unloving, unjust, or even non-existent, right? Um, in contrast, the speaker, a person of faith, asserts that the nature of the cosmos and its story and the way in which God has revealed himself through these things illustrates God's grandeur. Okay? God's grandeur. Okay? He's going to develop this impression throughout the poem. All right? Now, what is the genre or form of the poem? Well, it's a lyric poem that follows some of the conventions of an Italian sonnet. All right, for those of you that took Honors English 2, great course, if I do say so myself, you are already familiar with the Italian sonnet, which is a poem that is 14 lines long, written in iambic pentameter, in other words, 10 syllables of 5 iambic feet. Right, so every line has 10 syllables. Conventionally, again, the poet can depart from that, but when they do, it should be meaningful. All right, with a abba abba. Okay, so a b b a rhyme scheme, and then they can work with up to 3 sounds in the sestet. Right, so these first 2 quatrains constitute something that we call the octave or the octet. Right, raises a question or a concern, and then the sestet, the second 6 lines of the poem, which uses different sounds. All right, and then there's a volta in between the two, right, a kind of turning or a shift in the poem and in the poem's tone that answers that concern raised in the octave. Okay, so the rhyme scheme is divided into an octave and a sestet. The octave often raises a question, as I just said, and the sestet resolves that question in some way. Okay, the volta is a tone shift that occurs after the octet. As I already said, all right, today we're going to be studying and analyzing the octet of the poem, or the octave, as it's sometimes called. Okay, little sidebar: Hopkins' poem is not written in iambic pentameter. He uses something called sprung rhythm. All right, so he follows most of the conventions of an Italian sonnet, but he uses his rhythm kind of how he wants, when he wants to use it, the way he wants to. Okay, what's the title of the poem? The title of the poem is God's Grandeur. Okay, the poem's title alerts the reader that the sonnet and the sonnet's primary intention is to explore an attribute of God. All right, so God's what? Right, what is one of the attributes of God according to the speaker? His grandeur. All right, what is grandeur? Well, it's a word that is synonymous with this word splendor. All right, which is a word that we use to refer to extra, overabundant things. Extra overabundant beauty or extra overabundant goodness that exceeds that which is strictly necessary. Okay? So in my post gluten-free life, right? What a meal that satisfies my needs during the day might be some corn chips and some gluten-free pretzels and some peanut butter. But that certainly is not a splendid meal, right? Zaxby's is a splendid meal, right? Hardwood Smokehouse is a splendid meal. It is over and abundantly good. It satisfies my physical needs, but it's also extra delicious, all right? So a lot of times we, specifically in the Christian tradition, associate splendor with vice, the vice of overindulgence, okay, or incontinence. But that's an oversimplification, okay? Splendor is not only an attribute of God, as he has so clearly created an environment, a world, a cosmos that is not just functional, but rather beautiful, right? And what we tend to spend overabundant amounts of energy or money pursuing the beauty of are the things that we love, are the things that we value, right? When you ask a woman to marry you, you don't give her the cheapest ring you can come across, okay? Even if you're me, right? Right? You scrap together all of the money that you have and you buy an object that's not going to help you do anything except, right, to articulate to this woman that you want to marry, right? I love you and I want you to have this beautiful thing that is a symbol of my promise to you, to love you well, and my intention to marry you. We call it an engagement ring, right? And they're expensive, and they're made of precious metals, and really expensive rocks called diamonds. Okay, it's an example of a kind of overabundant outpouring. All right, and those kinds of things show what we love, right? The things that we spend more than that which is strictly necessary to do, right? That's what we love. Okay? What's our central question here? Our question is, how does the speaker's poetic style develop the poem's central thematic impression? What is this poem about? Well, it's obviously about God's grandeur. Fleshing out the nature of his grandeur is the project of the poem. Okay? So let's go ahead and read it one time through, and then we'll analyze it closely. I'm warning you, there is a lot in this wonderful poem. Okay, when I read this poem, it's like something written specifically in my native tongue. It's like written in the language that I was meant to speak in and to be spoken to in. Right, I remember when I spent weeks and months in Indonesia. Okay, and everyone around me was speaking languages that I couldn't fully understand. And I came back, and everyone around me was speaking English again. Okay, it was sweet. It was kind of cool. Right, it's like back to the native tongue. I can understand things. Right, in a lot of ways, I feel like this poem is just like written in my native tongue. God's Grandeur by Gerard Manly Hopkins. Hopkins writes, "The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil, crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil. And wears man's smudge, shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west went, O morning, at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with bright wings." Good words. All right, let's get into the process of analyzing this octet for our OTN in our remaining minutes here. All right, the poem begins with the line, "The world." Obviously, the world here just refers to creation, the cosmos, okay, the world, the universe that God has made. And what does the poet say about this world, this universe that God has made? It is charged. Okay, now the word charged has at least two meanings in this context. First of all, it's an implied metaphor that compares the created world to like a battery that's filled up with potential energy, right? That's waiting. Okay, it's charged up. It's ready. Okay, for work. It's ready for use. It's ready to do. It's ready to reveal that which it was made to reveal. Okay, It's also puns on the second meaning that a charge or something that is charged is something that has been commanded to or ordained to or entrusted with. Okay, like a charge. Sometimes you call a teacher's students their charges, right? Because they're the people that have been entrusted with or entrusted to that teacher's instruction, right? So in the same way, the world is charged. It's not only sort of filled up with potential energy, like a battery. It's also been entrusted with or commanded to or ordained to illustrate and manifest the grandeur of God. Okay, that word grandeur, as we already established, means the splendor or overabundant beauty of God. Okay, so in other words, the first line of the poem establishes the fact that God's world, the purpose of God's world, the purpose of the cosmos is, all right, the thing that has been entrusted with, the thing that has been ordained to do, the thing that the world has been created and commanded to do by its maker God is to reveal, right, his splendor, his overabundance, his extraness. All right. Now, the next two lines gives us two figurative examples of the way that that works. All right, and they're parallel and they're different. Okay, the first way that the speaker says that the world illustrates or manifests the grandeur of God is that it, meaning the grandeur of God, will flame out. It flames out. Okay, so on the most basic level, that's an image of it, just like sometimes the grandeur of God is manifested quickly, just obviously. It's fast, like when God filled the void with light, right? In a dramatic bang, all right. There was nothing, and then there was light, right? What a moment. Okay, but it also gathers to a greatness. Okay, so sometimes it's slow, sometimes it gathers itself up over time, sometimes it takes thousands of years in order for God's grandeur to be made manifest in the way that he has ordained it to be made manifest. All right, and these impressions are sharpened for us, right, with the connotations of these these pieces of figurative language, these similes. Okay, so sometimes it flames out like shining from shook foil. Okay, so here, what that line suggests that grandeur sometimes flames out or shines, which are juxtaposing words, right, that sort of illustrates the sublimity of God's self-revelation. Sometimes it's like a flame, like an all-consuming fire and a massive explosive revelation, and sometimes it shines. Sometimes it's benevolent and kind, soft, like the sun shining down on a warm spring day. All right? Now, the light imagery of the first line evokes and is associated with what very famous biblical moment, the creation of the world, in which God the Father fills up the void with light. All right, so this first line is directly related to one of the members of the Christian Godhead, the Christian triune God, right? Not the tribune God, right? My freshman kept calling the triune God the tribune God when we were studying Dante's Inferno. Classic freshman, okay? So the first member of the Christian Trinity, God the Father, is referenced here with this light imagery. Sometimes the grandeur of God illustrates itself like, all right, shining from shook foil. That light imagery evokes the revelation of God's glory in the creative action of God the Father in the beginning of time in Genesis, okay? Now, even further, right? Like shining from shook foil. Okay, well, foil, this is really interesting because foil is a common everyday material, right? It's something that you'll find in your kitchen. And the image here is that like it's this it'll flame out, right? It's like this violent, aggressive language that is juxtaposed with like a person shaking foil as they're getting it out to, I don't know, grill some corn on the cob in. Okay, the line suggests that God's self-revelation through creation occurs in the mundane, right? In the regular. But, right, notice from shook foil. Notice the adjective. It implies an action. Someone's doing some shaking. Someone's handling this foil. In other words, in order to appropriately see God's grandeur, creation must be held at the right angle. It must be held to the light. It implies that God's creatures must participate in the process, must open his eyes, must shake the foil and look and pay attention and see God's grandeur shining and watch God's grandeur flame out. Okay? Now, the second way that God's grandeur or splendor reveals itself, okay? So God's grandeur reveals itself through God the Father's creative action in which he fills up the void with light, all right? And that light, very much like the sun, rises every day and sets every day, is a part of our mundane experiences. And when looked upon in the correct way, when engaged with rightly, it illustrates God's splendor and majesty. All right, second line, right? It gathers to a greatness. It's slow, like the ooze of oil. Okay, notice the repeated G sounds. Gathers to a greatness, like the ooze of oil. Enjambment, crushed. Okay? The ooze of oil crushed, very much like the image, all right, that evoked of this sort of gathering greatness of this ooze of oil slowly moving over time that is then crushed dramatically. Okay? The line and its sonic or phonetic aesthetics gathers to a greatness. It builds to this conclusion with this enjambment line that is not in-stopped, right? Okay. So let's pay attention to the second simile a little bit, all right? The second simile, the second image that manifests God's greatness is more tactile. It's more carnal, all right? You can see light, but you can't hold it in your hands. Much like God the Father, who the line references, right? Is spirit, if you know your Westminster Catechism, right? He can't be held in your hand. Okay? The second simile is more tactile. It's more carnal than the first, right? You can feel the ooze of of oil. Okay? And this image as a whole has multiple connotations. Let's talk about two in particular. First of all, the image suggests that God's grandeur is often hidden beneath the surface of things. And like an olive, which you put in an olive press and then crush in order to release this great substance called olive oil, right? That helps food taste better, helps the cooking process be better. Okay, makes things more delicious and delightful, right? Okay. Very much in the same way, God's grandeur oftentimes must be it must be unpacked. It must be crushed. You must wring out the beauty of God that is hidden beneath the surface of the material world. God's grandeur must be mined, right? It must be crushed. It must be peeled back, right? It must be meditated on to be experienced and enjoyed. Okay. But secondly, okay, much like the first line references one of the triune God, right? God the Father. The second line, who does it reference? Well, of course, the anointed one who was crushed for the iniquity of mankind, to which all of history led, to which all of history in its slow plotting gathered over time to the climactic moment of Christ's death on a hill, Christ's death on Calvary. Okay? The enjammed run-on line leading to the capitalized crushed. All right? Along with the violent connotations of the word and the connotations of the phrase ooze of oil, right? Which the oil is something associated with anointing, right? It calls to mind God the Son, the incarnate, the tactile, the touchable God, the God who the disciples could come and put their hands, right, and their fingers in his nail-scarred hands. The God who healed with a touch, being crushed on the cross for our iniquities as a peace offering, as an olive branch to God the Father. And this leads, right, to a question. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Now, I want you to notice something interesting about the syntax, right? It's a little bit awkward. The word order is unnatural. Normally, you would say, "Why then do men now not wreck his rod?" Wreck meaning recognize. Rod meaning alluding to God being described as a good shepherd. Okay. Why do men then now not pay attention to his leadership, his guidance? Why do men not pay attention to God? If his grandeur is flaming out in creation, if it has been generally revealed in the mundane experiences of the sun rising and falling every day, in shining out like light, which he created to fill up the void, reflecting off of our kitchen materials. If he came, if all of history led to his incarnation, to his conception, right? Like the ooze of oil, and then he was crushed for your iniquities. In light of these two amazing, overabundant revelations of God's character, why do men not pay attention to him? Notice the syntax, why then now? Notice the double emphasize, the rhythm. Why do men then now not wreck his ride? The spondee emphasizes the continuum of our disobedience against God, both then, in the past, and now, presently. No room for the good old days, and no room for a progressive utopia. Then and now, we have refused to recognize his rod. Now, it's interesting, once again, that he uses rod here, because it references the language, biblical language throughout, very familiar to Christians, of God being described as a shepherd. Okay, it is in the best interest of the sheep to follow the shepherd. It is not in the best interest of the sheep to follow their own lead. He's a good shepherd. So why do we ignore him? 30 minutes has passed. If I'm going to finish this next quatrain, it's going to take a significant amount of time. So I'm going to cut us here and pick up the rest of this poem and finish the remainder of the octet and the sestet on Monday. I hope you guys have an excellent weekend, and I hope you continue to meditate on this poem before we finish it up on Monday. Have a great day.